On the morning of April 7th, 1945, the small Bavarian town of Weissenberg lay shrouded in an uneasy silence that seemed to press against the cobblestone streets like a heavy blanket. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and a light mist clung to the medieval walls that had protected this community for over 800 years. What the townspeople expected that morning was another day of rationed bread, whispered prayers, and the distant rumble of advancing Allied forces that had been growing steadily louder for weeks. What they believed about the nature of their eventual liberators had been shaped by years of carefully crafted propaganda that painted a picture of savage enemies bent on destruction and revenge. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded in the hours that followed would shatter every preconceived notion these German civilians held. As members of the 761st Tank Battalion, an all-black American unit, entered their town not as the vengeful conquerors they had been taught to fear, but as liberators whose actions would reveal the profound gap between propaganda and reality. Sergeant William "Tank" Johnson of the 761st Tank Battalion had been awake since 4 in the morning, going over maps in the dim light of his Sherman tank's interior. At 28 years old, Johnson had seen action across 3 countries and countless towns, but something about this particular morning felt different. The intelligence reports suggested minimal resistance in Weissenberg, but Johnson knew better than to trust reports alone. His experience fighting from Normandy through the Rhineland had taught him that every German town held its own unique challenges and surprises. The 761st Tank Battalion was part of a remarkable story within the larger narrative of the Second World War. Activated in March 1942 at Fort Knox, Kentucky, this unit was one of only a handful of black armored battalions in the entire United States Army. The path to their current position outside Weissenberg had been paved with both military victories and personal battles against discrimination that extended far beyond the European theater of operations. Corporal Marcus Thompson, Johnson's gunner, was meticulously cleaning the 75mm main gun of their Sherman tank when the first radio crackle indicated movement ahead. At just 22 years old, Thompson had joined the Army from Detroit, where his father worked in one of the Ford plants that had been converted to produce military equipment. The irony was not lost on him that the same industrial might that had initially excluded black workers from certain positions was now depending on their service overseas. The morning air carried the scent of wood smoke, and something else that experienced soldiers recognized immediately: the smell of fear. It was a mixture of unwashed bodies, cold sweat, and the metallic tang that seemed to emanate from communities that had been living under constant stress for months. As Johnson's tank rounded a bend in the road, the medieval walls of Weissenberg came into view, their ancient stones seeming to glow in the early morning light. Private First Class Robert "Doc" Williams, the tank's loader and medic, had been writing in his journal since before dawn. Williams was unusual among his fellow tankers. He had attended 2 years of college before the conflict began and had originally planned to become a teacher. His letters home to Birmingham, Alabama, painted detailed pictures of the landscapes they encountered and the people they met. On this particular morning, he noted the way the mist seemed to transform the German countryside into something that looked more like a fairy tale than a theater of conflict. The radio crackled to life with the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the white commander of the 761st, who had earned the deep respect of his men through his unwavering support and fair treatment. All units, proceed with caution. Intelligence suggests the town has been evacuated by German military forces, but we need to verify civilian status and ensure no hostile elements remain. Remember, these are civilian populations. We represent the United States of America. What Lieutenant Colonel Bates did not mention, but what every man in the battalion understood, was the additional burden they carried as black soldiers representing their country. They knew that their actions would be scrutinized not just by military superiors, but by a watching world that had been told conflicting stories about African American capabilities and character. The weight of representation was something that white units rarely had to consider, but it was a constant presence in the minds of these soldiers. As the lead elements of the battalion approached the town's outskirts, they encountered their first civilians, a group of elderly men who had remained behind when the German forces withdrew. These men, their faces lined with exhaustion and apprehension, stood uncertainly by the roadside, uncertain whether to flee or remain. When they saw the approaching American tanks, their expressions revealed a complex mixture of relief and confusion. Sergeant Johnson brought his Sherman to a halt approximately 50 yards from the group and radioed for an interpreter. What followed was a conversation that would set the tone for everything that came after. Through broken German and hand gestures, the elderly civilians indicated that most of the town's population, particularly the women and children, had taken shelter in the cellars and basements of the more substantial buildings near the town center. The propaganda that had shaped German civilian expectations about American forces had been particularly vicious regarding black soldiers. Years of carefully crafted messages had painted a picture of savage troops bent on destruction and revenge. The reality that greeted these first civilians was dramatically different. Sergeant Johnson, a soft-spoken man from rural Georgia who had worked as a mechanic before the conflict, approached the group with his hands visible and his weapon secured. His first words, translated through the interpreter, were to ask about the location of any wounded civilians who might need medical attention. Private Williams, whose medical training extended beyond his official role as a loader, immediately began preparing his aid kit when word came that there were injured elderly residents who had been unable to reach the shelters. The contrast between expectation and reality began to crystallize in those first moments. Where propaganda had promised savage conquerors, these German civilians encountered disciplined soldiers whose first concern was their welfare. The 761st Tank Battalion's approach to civilian populations had been shaped by their own experiences with discrimination and injustice. Unlike units that might view German civilians with universal suspicion or hostility, many of these black soldiers recognized the face of oppression and understood the difference between a regime and its victims. This perspective, born from their own struggles, would prove crucial in the hours that followed. As the tanks proceeded down the narrow medieval streets, their tracks echoing off the ancient stone walls, curious faces began to appear at windows and doorways. What these observers saw challenged every assumption they had held. The American soldiers were disciplined, organized, and professional. More significantly, they were treating German civilians with a respect and courtesy that contradicted every story the townspeople had been told. Technical Sergeant James Jazz Patterson, a former music teacher from New Orleans, who served as the battalion's communications specialist, had established a temporary command post in the town square. Patterson's job was to coordinate between the various tank crews and ensure that civilian areas were properly secured without causing unnecessary disruption to the local population. His approach was methodical and considerate, qualities that did not go unnoticed by the watching German civilians. The medieval town square of Weissenburg that morning presented a scene that seemed to belong more to a history book than to an active theater of conflict. Cobblestone streets that had witnessed centuries of human drama were now the stage for an encounter that would challenge fundamental assumptions about race, nationality, and human nature. The Gothic church that dominated one side of the square had stood for over 400 years, and its bells had rung for everything from weddings and harvests to invasions and retreats. On this morning, they remained silent, as if the ancient building itself was waiting to see what would unfold. Corporal Thompson had noticed something that his fellow tankers were also beginning to observe. The way German civilians looked at them was changing. The initial expressions of terror and confusion were gradually being replaced by something more complex. There was still fear, certainly, but it was accompanied by curiosity and, increasingly, a kind of bewildered relief. These were not the savage conquerors that propaganda had promised, and the cognitive dissonance was visible on the faces of the townspeople. Among the civilians emerging from their hiding places was Greta Müller, a 42-year-old widow whose husband had been drafted into the German army 2 years earlier and had not returned. Müller had spent the previous night in the basement of the local bakery with her 2 daughters, aged 14 and 16, listening to the approaching sounds of tanks and wondering what fate awaited them. The stories she had heard about American forces, particularly about black soldiers, had filled her with a terror that seemed to grip her very soul. When Muller finally emerged into the morning light, clutching her daughters close to her sides, she expected to encounter the monsters from her nightmares. Instead, she found herself face to face with Private Williams, who was distributing medical supplies to elderly residents who had been unable to access proper care during the chaotic final weeks of German military presence in the town. Williams, noticing that one of Muller's daughters appeared to be suffering from malnutrition, offered them food from his own rations without being asked. The moment when Williams handed Muller a chocolate bar for her youngest daughter became one of those small incidents that carry enormous historical weight. Muller later described the experience in letters that survived the conflict, noting not just the soldier's generosity, but his gentle manner and obvious concern for her family's welfare. The chocolate bar, a simple gesture of human kindness, represented everything that propaganda had told her to expect from American forces in reverse. Meanwhile, Sergeant Johnson was dealing with a more complex situation near the town's main intersection. A group of German women, led by the wife of the town's former mayor, had approached him to report that several elderly residents were trapped in a partially collapsed building near the edge of town. The building had been damaged during the German military's hasty evacuation, and the civilians inside were unable to free themselves without assistance. What followed was a rescue operation that would be talked about in Weissenburg for decades. Johnson immediately radioed for engineering support and medical assistance, then organized a team of volunteers from his unit to begin clearing debris. The sight of black American soldiers working alongside German civilians to rescue trapped townspeople created a powerful image that directly contradicted every stereotype that had been promoted by years of propaganda. Corporal Eddie "Fast Eddie" Washington, a former construction worker from Chicago, took charge of the rescue operation with the kind of expertise that comes from years of practical experience. Washington's approach was systematic and careful, ensuring that the rescue effort did not cause further structural damage that could endanger the trapped civilians. His commands were clear and professional, and he worked with the same dedication he would have shown if the trapped individuals had been American citizens. The technical challenges of the rescue operation required careful coordination between the tank crews and the civilian volunteers who knew the building's layout. Private First Class Tommy "Books" Anderson, who had studied engineering before being drafted, worked with local residents to determine the safest approach for removing debris without causing additional structural failure. The collaboration between American soldiers and German civilians in a common humanitarian effort created bonds that transcended national and racial boundaries. As the rescue operation continued, word spread throughout the town about what was happening. More civilians emerged from their hiding places, drawn by curiosity and the growing realization that these American soldiers represented something very different from what they had been led to expect. The crowd that gathered around the rescue site included people from every segment of the town's population: elderly residents, mothers with children, teenagers, and even a few German soldiers who had remained behind after their unit's withdrawal. The presence of German soldiers created a moment of tension that required careful handling. These soldiers, members of a rearguard unit that had been cut off during the general withdrawal, had initially planned to surrender to American forces when the opportunity arose. However, the sight of black American soldiers had created uncertainty about how they would be treated. Years of propaganda had convinced them that capture by African American troops would result in particularly harsh treatment. Lieutenant Colonel Bates, who had arrived on the scene to oversee the rescue operation, recognized the delicate nature of the situation. His decision to personally accept the surrender of the German soldiers, while ensuring that black members of his unit were treated with full respect and authority, sent a powerful message to both the surrendering soldiers and the watching civilians. The formal surrender ceremony that followed was conducted with military precision and mutual respect that surprised everyone present. The rescued civilians, an elderly couple named Hans and Emma Hoffman, who had been married for 47 years, emerged from their ordeal with injuries that required immediate medical attention. Private Williams and 2 other medics from the battalion provided treatment that probably saved both their lives. Emma Hoffman, who had been unconscious when rescued, regained awareness to find herself being tended by a Black American soldier whose gentle competence directly contradicted everything she had been taught to believe about such men. The medical treatment provided to German civilians by the 761st Tank Battalion became one of the most powerful symbols of the day's events. These soldiers, who had every reason to harbor resentment against a nation that had waged aggressive conflict against their country, while simultaneously maintaining a system of racial segregation that denied them full citizenship rights, instead demonstrated a level of humanity and professionalism that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature. Dr. Samuel "Doc" Robinson, the battalion's chief medical officer and one of the few black doctors serving in a combat unit, established a temporary medical station in the town's former school building. Robinson, who had graduated from Howard University Medical School before being commissioned, found himself treating German civilians with the same dedication he would have shown to American patients. The irony of providing medical care to citizens of a nation that had allied itself with ideas of racial superiority was not lost on him, but his professional ethics and personal character demanded nothing less than his best effort. The medical station became a focal point for civilian-military interaction throughout the day. German mothers brought children who had been suffering from malnutrition and minor injuries, while elderly residents sought treatment for conditions that had been neglected during the chaotic final months of the conflict in their region. Each interaction between American medical personnel and German civilians helped to break down the barriers of fear and prejudice that had been carefully constructed by years of propaganda. Anna Becker, a 26-year-old nurse who had been working in the town's small clinic, volunteered to assist the American medical team despite her initial terror at the prospect of working alongside black soldiers. Becker's decision to volunteer was motivated partly by her professional dedication and partly by her growing realization that her fears had been based on lies rather than reality. Her experience working alongside Dr. Robinson and his team became a transformation that she would later describe as one of the most important learning experiences of her life. The collaboration between German and American medical personnel in treating civilian casualties created an environment where professional competence and human compassion transcended racial and national boundaries. Becker found herself learning new techniques from American medics who had gained extensive experience treating combat injuries, while the Americans benefited from her knowledge of local medical conditions and her ability to communicate effectively with anxious patients. As word of the American medical station spread throughout the town, a steady stream of civilians began arriving to seek treatment for a variety of conditions. Many of these individuals had been avoiding medical care due to their fear of the occupying forces, but the reports of professional and compassionate treatment overcame their hesitation. Each successful treatment helped to build trust and demonstrated the gap between propaganda-fueled expectations and actual reality. The afternoon brought an unexpected development when a group of displaced persons who had been hiding in the forests outside town approached the American positions seeking assistance. This group included political prisoners who had escaped during the chaos of the German military withdrawal, as well as forced laborers from several European countries who had been working in local factories. The diversity of the group seeking American protection created a complex humanitarian situation that required careful handling. Sergeant First Class Luther Preacher Davis, a former minister from Mississippi who served as the battalion's chaplain and liaison for civilian affairs, took charge of organizing assistance for the displaced persons. Davis's background in community organization and his natural ability to work with people from diverse backgrounds made him ideally suited for this challenging assignment. His approach was to treat each individual with dignity while ensuring that proper procedures were followed for their protection and eventual repatriation or resettlement. The displaced persons camp that Davis organized in the town's former market square became a microcosm of wartime Europe's complexity. French forced laborers worked alongside escaped political prisoners and refugees from multiple countries, all under the protection of Black American soldiers who understood something about being marginalized and displaced. The camp's multinational character created opportunities for cultural exchange that enriched everyone involved. Among the displaced persons was Marcel Dubois, a French resistance member who had been captured 6 months earlier and had been forced to work in a local factory producing components for German military equipment. Dubois spoke several languages and became an invaluable translator and liaison between the American forces and the various civilian populations they were protecting. His perspective on the black American soldiers was particularly interesting, as he had no preconceived notions based on American racial prejudices and could evaluate them purely on their actions and character. The evening of April 7th brought an event that would be remembered by everyone present as a turning point in their understanding of human nature and possibility. As the sun began to set behind the medieval walls of Weissenburg, the civilians who had spent the day interacting with the American forces organized an impromptu gesture of gratitude that surprised even the soldiers who had been the recipients of civilian cooperation throughout the day. The gesture took the form of a simple meal shared between American soldiers and German civilians in the town square. The idea had originated with Greta Müller, whose daughter had received the chocolate bar from Private Williams that morning. Müller had spent the day observing the American soldiers and had become convinced that everything she had been told about them was false. Her decision to invite them to share a meal was both an act of gratitude and a public rejection of the prejudices she had been taught to hold. The meal was modest, a combination of military rations provided by the Americans and whatever ingredients the German civilians could contribute from their limited supplies. What made it significant was not the food itself, but the symbolism of former enemies choosing to share a table in an act of mutual respect and recognition of common humanity. The image of black American soldiers and German civilians eating together in the shadow of a medieval church challenged assumptions held by observers from both cultures. Technical Sergeant Patterson, whose musical background had been well known throughout the battalion, brought out a harmonica as the meal concluded and began playing a slow, soulful melody that seemed to capture the complex emotions of the day. The music transcended language barriers and created a moment of shared reflection that affected everyone present. Several German civilians later described this impromptu concert as one of the most moving experiences of their lives. The harmonica music was joined by singing, first from American soldiers who harmonized with Patterson's melody, and then from German civilians who added their own voices to the mix. The resulting musical collaboration created something entirely new, a fusion of American jazz influences and German folk traditions that could only have emerged from this unique set of circumstances. The music continued for over an hour, with different individuals taking turns leading songs or offering instrumental contributions. As full darkness settled over Weissenburg, the realities of military occupation reasserted themselves, but in a form very different from what anyone had expected. Instead of harsh martial law and strict curfews, the American forces implemented a system of civilian self-governance with military oversight that allowed the town to begin the process of returning to normal life while ensuring security for all residents. Lieutenant Colonel Bates met with a council of German civilian leaders to establish procedures for maintaining order and distributing humanitarian supplies. The meeting was conducted with a level of mutual respect that surprised the German participants, who had expected to be treated as conquered enemies rather than partners in rebuilding their community. Bates's approach was to work with existing civilian leadership while ensuring that American military authority was clearly established and respected. The civilian council that emerged from these discussions included Greta Müller, who had demonstrated natural leadership abilities throughout the day's events, as well as Anna Becker, whose medical expertise would be crucial for maintaining public health during the transition period. The inclusion of German women in leadership roles was particularly significant, as it demonstrated American commitment to principles of equality and representation that contrasted sharply with the authoritarian system that had previously governed their lives. The administrative challenges of governing a liberated town required careful coordination between military authorities and civilian leaders. Issues ranging from food distribution to maintaining public services needed immediate attention, and the solutions required input from people who understood local conditions and needs. The collaborative approach adopted by the 761st Tank Battalion helped to ensure that these challenges were addressed effectively, while building trust between occupiers and civilians. One of the most significant developments during the evening was the establishment of a communication system that allowed German civilians to send messages to family members in other parts of Germany. Many residents had been cut off from relatives for months and had no knowledge of their safety or whereabouts. The American forces, recognizing the humanitarian importance of family communication, worked with civilian volunteers to create a message relay system that helped reunite families and provide peace of mind to anxious relatives. The message system became a focal point for community cooperation, with German civilians volunteering their time to help organize and transmit communications, while American soldiers provided security and transportation for the message carriers. This collaboration created additional opportunities for positive interaction between former enemies and helped to reinforce the bonds of mutual respect that had been developing throughout the day. As the first night of American occupation settled over Weissenburg, the contrast between expectations and reality had become impossible to ignore. German civilians who had spent months dreading the arrival of American forces, particularly black American forces, instead found themselves under the protection of soldiers whose behavior consistently demonstrated professionalism, compassion, and respect for human dignity. The transformation in civilian attitudes was remarkable and would have lasting implications for post-conflict reconstruction efforts. The security arrangements for the night reflected the trust that had been built during the day's interactions. Instead of implementing harsh curfews and military patrols, the American forces worked with civilian volunteers to establish a community watch system that allowed residents to maintain a sense of agency and control over their own security. This approach required careful coordination but resulted in a much more stable and cooperative environment than typically emerged in occupied territories. Private Williams found himself assigned to the night watch with several German volunteers, including Hans Hoffmann, the elderly man who had been rescued from the collapsed building earlier in the day. The conversation between Williams and Hoffmann, conducted through a combination of broken German, basic English, and extensive hand gestures, covered topics ranging from their respective families to their hopes for the future. Despite the language barrier, both men found common ground in their shared humanity and their desire for peace. The night watch conversations became an opportunity for cultural exchange that enriched everyone involved. American soldiers shared stories about their homes and families, while German civilians provided insights into local history and traditions. These personal connections helped to humanize both sides and created relationships that would extend far beyond the immediate military occupation. The dawn of April 8th brought new challenges and opportunities as word of the peaceful liberation of Weissenburg began to spread to surrounding communities. Other towns in the region had heard reports of the events in Weissenburg, and several sent delegations to see for themselves whether the stories of respectful treatment by black American forces could possibly be true. The arrival of these delegations created opportunities to extend the positive example established in Weissenburg to a wider area. Among the visiting delegations was a group from the neighboring town of Treuchtlingen, led by Father Heinrich Weber, a Catholic priest who had maintained his moral authority throughout the conflict by consistently speaking out against injustice and persecution. Father Weber's endorsement of the American soldiers' conduct carried enormous weight with German civilians throughout the region, as his reputation for integrity and moral courage was widely respected. Father Weber's conversations with Lieutenant Colonel Bates and other American officers revealed a mutual respect for principled leadership and moral courage that transcended national and racial boundaries. Weber had spent years protecting Jewish residents and other persecuted groups within his parish, often at considerable personal risk, while Bates had demonstrated similar moral courage in his consistent support for the rights and dignity of his black soldiers within a segregated military system. The meeting between Father Weber and Dr. Robinson was particularly significant, as both men were highly educated professionals who shared common interests in medicine, theology, and social justice. Their lengthy discussion of medical ethics, the role of religion in healing, and the challenges of maintaining moral principles during wartime created a foundation for ongoing collaboration between German and American communities in the post-conflict period. The expanding network of positive relationships between American forces and German civilians began to create momentum for broader changes in the region. As stories of respectful treatment and humanitarian assistance spread, more civilians began to emerge from hiding and to cooperate with occupation authorities. This cooperation was particularly important for identifying and addressing ongoing humanitarian needs, as well as for beginning the process of rebuilding civil society. The humanitarian challenges in the region were extensive, as months of conflict and displacement had created shortages of food, medical supplies, and basic necessities. The American forces worked with civilian leaders to establish distribution networks that ensured aid reached those most in need while maintaining fairness and preventing the development of black market activities that could undermine social stability. The distribution system that emerged from these collaborative efforts became a model for other liberated communities in the region. By combining American logistical capabilities with German knowledge of local needs and conditions, the system was able to operate efficiently and fairly while building trust between former enemies. The success of this collaboration demonstrated the potential for positive post-conflict reconstruction when occupying forces approached their responsibilities with respect for human dignity and commitment to justice. The educational implications of the events in Weissenberg began to emerge as Anna Becker and several other German civilians expressed interest in learning more about American society and culture. Their previous knowledge had been limited to propaganda portrayals that bore little resemblance to the reality they were experiencing. The American soldiers, in turn, were eager to share accurate information about their country and their hopes for the future. These informal educational exchanges covered topics ranging from American democratic institutions to the experiences of African Americans in various regions of the United States. The German civilians were particularly surprised to learn about the educational and professional achievements of the black soldiers, many of whom had attended college or worked in skilled professions before being drafted. This information directly contradicted propaganda portrayals of African Americans as intellectually inferior and culturally primitive. The educational exchanges also provided opportunities for American soldiers to learn about German history and culture from perspectives that had not been shaped by wartime propaganda. Many of the soldiers discovered that German civilians shared their values regarding family, education, and community, despite the political system that had governed their country during the conflict. These discoveries helped to humanize former enemies and created foundations for lasting peace. Sergeant Johnson found himself engaged in lengthy conversations with several German veterans of the First World War who were able to provide unique perspectives on the experience of military service and the challenges of returning to civilian life after combat. These conversations revealed common experiences and concerns that transcended national boundaries and helped to create bonds of mutual understanding between former enemies. The technical expertise of the American soldiers became increasingly valuable as the liberation of Weissenberg evolved into a reconstruction effort. Many of the black soldiers possessed skills in mechanics, construction, electrical work, and other trades that were desperately needed for repairing infrastructure and restoring essential services. Their willingness to contribute these skills to benefit German civilians demonstrated a level of generosity that further challenged stereotypes and built lasting relationships. Corporal Washington's construction expertise proved particularly valuable when it came to repairing the structural damage that had occurred during the final weeks of German military presence in the town. Washington organized mixed teams of American soldiers and German civilians to address the most urgent repair needs, creating work crews that functioned as integrated units despite language barriers and cultural differences. The integrated work crews became powerful symbols of the potential for cooperation between former enemies. The sight of black American soldiers and German civilians working side by side to rebuild damaged structures demonstrated practical cooperation that went far beyond mere military occupation. These collaborative efforts created personal relationships that would continue long after the formal end of the conflict. The success of the reconstruction efforts in Weissenberg began to attract attention from higher levels of military command, as senior officers recognized the potential for using this model in other liberated communities. The peaceful transition from military occupation to collaborative reconstruction offered significant advantages over more traditional approaches that relied primarily on military authority and formal administrative structures. As the second week of the liberation period began, the transformation of relationships between American forces and German civilians had become so complete that visitors from other communities often had difficulty believing the reports they had heard. The sight of Black American soldiers and German civilians working together, eating together and planning together for the future challenged fundamental assumptions about race, nationality, and human nature that many observers had held as unquestioned truths. The documentation of these events began to take on historical significance as both American soldiers and German civilians recognized that they were participating in something extraordinary. Private Williams continued his detailed journal entries, while several German civilians began keeping their own written records of their experiences. These documents would later provide valuable insights into the process of reconciliation and the factors that enabled former enemies to develop positive relationships. The photographic documentation of events in Weissenburg, captured by Staff Sergeant Robert Flash Johnson, a former newspaper photographer from Philadelphia who served as the battalion's official photographer, created a visual record that would challenge stereotypes for generations to come. Johnson's photographs showed integrated work crews, shared meals, medical treatment being provided across racial and national lines, and moments of genuine human connection that contradicted everything that propaganda had suggested about relationships between these groups. The impact of Sergeant Johnson's photographs extended far beyond their immediate documentary value, as they provided evidence that alternative approaches to military occupation and post-conflict reconstruction were not only possible, but could be remarkably successful. The images of cooperation and mutual respect would later be used in training programs for military personnel and in educational materials, designed to promote understanding between different groups. The musical collaborations that had begun on the first evening continued to develop and expand, creating a unique cultural fusion that reflected the broader cooperation taking place in the community. Technical Sergeant Patterson organized regular evening concerts that featured both American and German musicians, creating opportunities for cultural exchange that enriched everyone involved, while providing entertainment and emotional relief during a difficult period. The musical collaboration produced several original compositions that attempted to capture the unique experience of reconciliation between former enemies. These songs, combining American jazz influences with German folk traditions, created something entirely new that could only have emerged from the specific circumstances of Weissenburg. The music became a powerful symbol of the potential for creating beauty and meaning from situations that had initially seemed hopeless. The success of the musical collaboration inspired other forms of artistic and cultural exchange. Several German civilians who were skilled in traditional crafts began teaching their techniques to interested American soldiers, while the Americans shared their knowledge of modern manufacturing processes and innovative approaches to problem-solving. These exchanges created additional opportunities for building personal relationships and mutual respect. The educational programs that had begun informally continued to expand and develop structure, as both American and German participants recognized their value. Dr. Robinson organized medical education seminars that brought together American medics and German medical personnel to share knowledge and techniques, while other specialists offered instruction in engineering, mechanics, and various technical skills. The medical education seminars became particularly valuable as they addressed not only technical knowledge, but also approaches to medical ethics and the treatment of patients from different cultural backgrounds. Dr. Robinson's emphasis on the universal nature of medical obligations and the importance of treating all patients with dignity regardless of their race, nationality, or political background resonated strongly with German medical personnel who had witnessed the corruption of their profession under the previous regime. As the liberation period extended into its third week, the administrative challenge of integrating Weissenberg into the broader Allied occupation structure began to require attention. The success of the collaborative model that had been established made it a valuable test case for post-conflict reconstruction, but it also needed to be sustainable within the larger framework of military administration and political objectives. Lieutenant Colonel Bates worked closely with higher command to ensure that the positive example established in Weissenberg could be maintained while meeting the requirements of broader military and political objectives. His reports emphasized the practical benefits of the collaborative approach, including reduced security requirements, increased civilian cooperation, and more rapid progress in reconstruction efforts. The transition to a more formal administrative structure was handled carefully to preserve the positive relationships that had been established while ensuring compatibility with broader occupation policies. The civilian council that had been formed during the first week was given official recognition and expanded authority, creating a model of shared governance that balanced military security needs with civilian self-determination. The success of the shared governance model in Weissenberg attracted attention from political leaders and military commanders who were responsible for planning long-term occupation and reconstruction policies. The town became a showcase for alternative approaches to post-conflict administration that emphasized cooperation and mutual respect rather than purely military control. The international implications of the Weissenberg example began to emerge as news of the successful collaboration between Black American forces and German civilians reached other theaters of operation and political leaders in Washington, London, and other Allied capitals. The demonstration that racial integration could work effectively, even in challenging circumstances, provided ammunition for advocates of civil rights reform within the United States and influenced discussions about post-war military organization. The irony that Black American soldiers were demonstrating the potential for racial integration while serving in a segregated military system was not lost on observers from various political perspectives. The success of the 761st Tank Battalion in Weissenberg provided concrete evidence that could be used to challenge arguments about the inevitability or necessity of racial segregation in American society. The personal transformation experienced by individual German civilians became one of the most powerful aspects of the Weissenberg story. Greta Müller, who had begun the liberation period in terror of the approaching American forces, had become one of the most effective advocates for cooperation and understanding between the two communities. Her journey from fear to friendship illustrated the potential for human growth and change, even in the most challenging circumstances. Müller's transformation was particularly significant because it occurred in full view of her community and involved a complete reversal of deeply held beliefs about race and nationality. Her willingness to publicly acknowledge her previous errors and to work actively for improved understanding between groups demonstrated the kind of moral courage that was essential for genuine reconciliation. The transformation of Anna Becker from a fearful civilian into an effective member of an integrated medical team illustrated the professional and personal growth that could result from cooperation across racial and national lines. Becker's experience working with Dr. Robinson and other American medical personnel provided her with new skills and perspectives that would benefit her patients and her community for years to come. The children of Weissenberg experienced perhaps the most profound transformation of all as they grew up during a period when cooperation between Americans and Germans was the normal state of affairs rather than something extraordinary. The children who had been taught to fear and hate American forces, particularly Black American forces, instead experienced them as protectors, teachers, and friends who contributed to their community's well-being. The impact of the Weissenberg experience on the American soldiers was equally profound, as they discovered that their professional competence and personal character were recognized and respected by people who had initially been their enemies. This recognition provided validation that had been denied to them within their own segregated society and demonstrated the arbitrary nature of racial prejudice. For many of the black soldiers, the experience of being treated with respect and dignity by German civilians while serving in a segregated American military system created complex emotions and perspectives that would influence their post-war lives and their contributions to the civil rights movement. The contrast between their treatment by former enemies and their treatment by their own country was stark and politically significant. The technical and professional competence demonstrated by the black soldiers in Weissenberg provided clear evidence that racial segregation in the military was based on prejudice rather than practical considerations. The successful integration of American and German personnel in various work and social situations demonstrated that cooperation across racial lines was not only possible but could be remarkably productive. The long-term implications of the Weissenberg example extended far beyond the immediate military and political context. The demonstration that people from different racial and cultural backgrounds could work together effectively, when prejudice was set aside, provided a powerful precedent for post-war social and political reform movements. The documentation and publicity surrounding the Weissenberg example helped to influence public opinion about racial integration and contributed to the momentum that would eventually lead to major civil rights reforms in the United States. The photographs, journal entries, and official reports from Weissenberg provided concrete evidence that could be used to challenge arguments for maintaining racial segregation. The international recognition of the Weissenberg example also contributed to America's reputation as a champion of democracy and human rights during the early stages of the Cold War. The demonstration that American ideals could be successfully implemented, even in challenging circumstances, provided valuable propaganda advantages in the competition for international influence and support. As the formal military occupation of Weissenberg transitioned to civilian administration in the late spring of 1945, the relationships that had been established between American soldiers and German civilians evolved, but did not disappear. Many of the soldiers maintained correspondence with German families and individuals, creating lasting personal connections that transcended the immediate military context. The correspondence between American soldiers and German civilians provided ongoing opportunities for cultural exchange and mutual education that enriched both sides. These personal relationships helped to humanize both Americans and Germans for each other and contributed to a broader understanding of shared human values and aspirations that transcended national boundaries. The educational and professional connections established during the Liberation period also continued to develop and expand. Several German medical personnel maintained professional correspondence with Dr. Robinson and other American medical officers, leading to exchanges of medical knowledge and techniques that benefited patients in both countries. The agricultural and technical knowledge shared between American soldiers and German civilians during the Liberation period contributed to improved farming practices and industrial techniques that helped to accelerate economic recovery in the region. The practical benefits of this cooperation demonstrated the value of international exchange and collaboration in addressing common challenges. The children who had experienced the liberation of Weissenberg grew up with perspectives on race and nationality that were fundamentally different from those of previous generations. These young people became advocates for international understanding and cooperation, carrying the lessons of their childhood experiences into their adult lives and professional careers. The impact of the Weissenberg experience on post-war German society extended beyond the immediate participants to influence broader discussions about democracy, human rights, and international cooperation. The example of successful collaboration between former enemies provided a foundation for the reconstruction of German political and social institutions along democratic lines. The veterans of the 761st Tank Battalion, who had participated in the liberation of Weissenberg, became some of the most effective advocates for civil rights reform in the post-war United States. Their first-hand experience of successful racial integration in military and civilian settings provided them with powerful arguments and concrete examples that could be used to challenge segregation in American society. The military careers of the officers and soldiers who had demonstrated effective leadership in Weissenberg were enhanced by their success, leading to opportunities for advancement that might otherwise have been denied to them due to racial prejudice. Their professional success helped to open doors for other black military personnel and contributed to the gradual integration of the American armed forces. The administrative and logistical innovations developed during the liberation of Weissenburg were adopted by other military units and became part of standard procedures for post-conflict reconstruction operations. The emphasis on civilian cooperation and respect for human dignity became incorporated into military training and doctrine, influencing military operations for decades to come. The academic study of the Weissenburg example by historians, sociologists, and political scientists contributed to scholarly understanding of the factors that promote successful reconciliation between former enemies. The detailed documentation available for this case made it a valuable resource for researchers studying conflict resolution and post-conflict reconstruction. The lessons learned from the Weissenburg experience were applied in other post-conflict situations around the world, contributing to more effective and humane approaches to military occupation and reconstruction. The emphasis on cooperation and mutual respect became a model for international peacekeeping and nation-building efforts in subsequent decades. As the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Weissenburg approached in 2015, efforts were made to document and commemorate the historic events that had taken place there. Surviving veterans from both sides, along with German civilians who had experienced the liberation as children, gathered to share their memories and reflect on the lasting significance of their shared experience. The commemoration events included the dedication of a memorial recognizing the contribution of the 761st Tank Battalion to the liberation and reconstruction of the town. The memorial inscription, written in both English and German, emphasized the themes of cooperation, mutual respect, and shared humanity that had characterized the liberation period. The oral history project conducted as part of the 70th anniversary commemoration captured the memories and perspectives of the few remaining participants in the original events. These interviews provided valuable insights into the personal impact of the liberation experience and its lasting influence on the lives of those involved. The educational materials developed for the commemoration were distributed to schools and historical organizations throughout the region, ensuring that the lessons of the Weissenburg example would be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The emphasis on the potential for cooperation and understanding between different groups remained relevant for contemporary challenges involving cultural and racial diversity. The international attention focused on the 70th anniversary commemoration helped to renew interest in the history of Black American military service during the Second World War, and to recognize the contributions of African American soldiers to Allied victory. The Weissenburg story became part of a broader effort to ensure that the full diversity of the American military experience was acknowledged and celebrated. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.